Good morning, afternoon, and evening, because I really don't know from which part of the world you're going to join today. So welcome to everybody. Today, my session will be on refugees and gender-related persecution or determination of refugee status as a result of gender. Rather, let's put it this way, that I will talk about how gender factors in the whole situation of displacement and asylum. Since it is just, a 10 minutes lecture, I'm going to be very cryptic. But let me first introduce myself. I am Professor Paula Banerjee from the University of Calcutta. I'm a professor there. I also belong to an avant-garde think tank that works on migration and forced migration. And I'm very proud to say that one of our terminologies have today been accepted by UNHCR, and that is mixed and massive flows. So I'm here to talk to you about the mixed and massive flows from the perspective of gender, and this terminology was first brought out by the Calcutta Research Group, of which I am a proud member. Okay, to begin with, let's put it this way, that when the 1951 convention was brought out, then the whole notion of, let alone sex, what gender, the whole notion of gender probably did not even exist in the political or international parlance. But, what could have been done was that women's voices could have been included in this discussion. But if one looks at the participants of the final act, the so-called final act before the signing of the convention and then its ratification by something like 145 countries, we will see that there were hardly any women in the group. So obviously women's voices were completely lost. Now let me begin with a clarificatory exercise, and that is, gender doesn't automatically mean women. Gender, is, as we say, socially and culturally constructed. It talks about social roles, so even men can talk about gender or gendered crimes or gendered persecution. But most often we see that over 90% of gendered claims are made by women or the LGBTQ community. So today, gender also actually encompasses, particularly when we talk about the rights within the gender discourse, it encompasses largely women and also the LGBTQ community, or the third gender or the 12th gender, or whatever may be the case. There are very few women who make claims for refugee status on basis of gendered persecution. Now, let us begin at the beginning. So as I was saying, that in the 1951 convention, there were hardly any female representation or hardly any women there. So that is why the prism of looking at refugees or asylum seekers or claims made on the basis of asylum was largely a male prism. I've written recently when talking about, because one has to realize that this is the 70th year of the Refugee Convention. So I've written elsewhere that, today when we look back, we see that the refugee or the figure of the refugee that was constructed as a result of the Refugee Convention was that of a male, of a politically involved personality. So even children were not thought about as refugees at that point of time, and a claim-making individual. So that is why, it took a long while for people to realize that there were other genders also who were making claims to refugeehood, because you all by now know that this was a Eurocentric, it is an oft repeated phrase, that this was a Eurocentric instrument. And, the thing is, if you look at the people who were participants in this discussions, you will see that there were representation, if one looks at Asia, this huge continent of Asia, there were only representations from Iraq, Iran, and Israel, no India. And 1951 was after the partition. So there should have been India. It was after the Israel-Palestine conflict, so there should have been Palestinians. And, the whole of Africa was being decolonized, but there was only Egypt present there. So there was this geographical issue, and there was also multiple problems, but one major problem was gender. Gender actually came much later. In 1984, the European Union first said that gendered claims or claims made by women on the basis of persecution for gendered reason or reasons for their gender should be accepted. And then, UNHCR accepted it via Conclusion 39 in 1985. The first written document from a country was by Canada in 1993, and then later by 1995, United States and Australia accepted that women could make particular claims. Now, for the other genders, I'm not talking about masculinities, but other gendered crimes, whether it's from LGBTQ community, from gay community, all of these came much later in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. On 7th May 2002, there was this, discussion and a signature of a new conclusion. And that is when the whole notion that homosexuality cannot be a reason for persecution and gendered claims can be made on the basis of, one's sexuality or sexually driven propensities and people's right to love. So, all of these came, as I said, much later in 2002. Now, the problem is, in much of these discussions is that the prism actually did not change because the convention did not change. In terms of geographical limitations, there was the protocol, the 67 protocol, where the temporality and the spatiality question was taken over. But there was no such amendment or no such protocol on the basis of gender. So gender really did not figure. How did gender become part of that? We all know that it was as a special social group. But even as a special social group, women had to make claims on the basis of the same grounds on persecution and on, that persecution or fear, well-grounded fear, has to be on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, social group, political opinion, etc. Now, I think the most successful proponents of such claims were made by, rape. Rape was accepted as a weapon, a weapon of war. And why did this happen? Because exactly when this discussion was beginning, it was based on the political happenings that were happening in Bosnia and Rwanda. So in both these spaces, rape had become a huge issue. But interestingly, in the 71 Bangladesh and Pakistan conflict, or East and West Pakistan conflict, we had over 200,000 women being raped. But rape did not become a question, an issue of persecution at that point of time. So, in much of this, a silent factor that worked was, of course, racial. If rape happens in the formerly colonized world, then it was accepted. It was considered as, these are the places where there's a lot of barbarism. But, that was again a sort of a racial, understanding, which was often wrong. It was based on race. And then, so rape became an accepted ground as a ground for accepting persecution. The other very successful movement was done by women activists of Africa. Although female genital mutilation is something that is most prevalent in the continent of Africa, it is also, present in other continents as well. But the push came from African women. So, female genital mutilation became a ground for accepting gendered claims. Even women who had already been mutilated also got asylum because of this. But there were multiple other grounds, which even though the 2002 conclusion that was signed, conclusion 87, if I'm not mistaken, even though it talks about domestic violence, but domestic violence or other forms of gender violence was not or never really got the importance that sexual violence got in terms of refugee determination, because the prism was male-centric. And the prism was largely from the perspective of men's eyes. So that is why for gender, the problem was all other gender crimes became obliterated. And that was also carried over when one talked about or signed the 1325, treaties. Because even though 1325 was the first proactive treaty for women's rights to be sitting there and deciding on war and peace, but still the main crime for refugees that 1325 was relevant for was again sexual grounds. So you see, that prism never shifted, and without a overhauling, particularly from the Global South, the most important proponents for bringing in gender and gendered claims were Global South. Now, I have to clear one understanding here, and that is most 80% of the world refugees are in the Global South. They originate from Global South. The root causes are rampant with political involvement of imperial and colonial countries, and it may be as a result of decolonization. So most of the refugees originated from the Global South, remained in Global South. So the main activists were women from the Global South, but there was no overhauling of the Refugee Convention from the prism of gender, as a result of which women, other genders, find it extremely difficult to get asylum, basing their claims on gender rights, which needs to be looked into, particularly because one has to remember the background of what is happening in Afghanistan today. Thousands of women are there to be tortured, to be persecuted by different groups, but they don't have a voice. Who will take up the cause of this mass of women? Individual women's claims are acceptable, but not women as a community. And today, Afghanistan makes it really clear to us why a gender claim is so important for the refugee communities. Thank you.